Hazur, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I have two questions, if I permit to ask two. I was at the Hartlepool. I was at the Hartlepool forum where a gentleman asked about our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Hajj, whereas why Ahmadis can't go there. You gave to me the best answer I've ever heard, but there was a colleague who was with me who wasn't convinced. He wanted to know why, if the Holy Prophet ﷺ was a perfect man, well, why was his sins needed forgiving for the future? I was happy with the answer, but if you could answer it again, because I'm keen to tell him the answer.
You see, this promise which is mentioned in the Holy Quran, in fact, is a prophecy by God all-knowing that this Prophet of Allah is above sin. So it's expressed in a very beautiful way, by way of reward for perfect submission at the time of extreme trial. It's submission to the will of Allah, which was so pleasing to God that He wanted to reward it. But the reward, in my opinion, was this declaration that this man is above sin. Otherwise, we believe all prophets of Allah are innocent. They can't sin. But another reason why this was said so, I believe, is that despite the fact that the prophets are told by God that you are sinless, and they know it, of course, to a degree, yet in their humility, they see small specks as human failings to be sins. So as the standard of piety rises, so also the realization of sin becomes enlarged, and one begins to see sins where there are no sins but just normal human failings. So in that regard, we must always translate the word sin when it is used against the prophets as having a different connotation than when it is applied to ordinary sinful people. Sin in the sight of a prophet, as he becomes not only perfect in the sense that he constantly improves in his conduct, in his attitude to God. So every stage of his life is perfect, but not in the sense of final absolute perfectness, absolute perfection. Because absolutely perfect is only God. So that is why I have to explain this. Being perfect, he can still be better. That is also a point which is well established from the Holy Quran. وَلَلْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى. Every other moment that comes in your life is better than the previous one. So, in my opinion, the word perfection is also to be fully understood. In this particular regard, I think perfection should mean that a person is sinless as far as he can, he understands sin. But his understanding of sin goes on broadly. And things which are very small specks, even things which are counted not as failings but as achievements in case of ordinary people, begin to appear in the sight of these perfect people as failings and sins. In their humility, they keep seeking forgiveness of Allah for all these small things. So as you also observe the same phenomenon in ordinary life, where when there are higher expectations from a person of a noble birth, there he is taunted for even the smallest failing, while the person who taunts him ordinarily leads a life which is so full of defects and even crimes. So this is a relative matter, a question of relativity. So in that light, in that background, now if I return to that verse of the Holy Quran, I believe God gave him this glad tidings that even if you think that you have sinned, we know you don't sin, but even if you think you have sinned, even if you are repentant at something which you consider failing, we declare that from now on all your so-called, in inverted comma sins are forgiven forever. So these are very minute areas of understanding of such verses. Because there was not time for that explanation during that session, so I just passed by. I hope you have got the answer now.
I have, most certainly.
You will be able to, I hope, satisfy the person whom you want to.
I certainly will. My other question is. My other question is. I was listening to one of your tapes a week ago. You were talking on the Prophet Jonah and the Prophet Zechariah.
Right.
The thing that I'm very curious about is you commented on how a lot of Ahmadis, when they speak about Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, whereas we quote something from the Bible, or the 3 days and the 3 nights.
Right.
My question is, how, if we can't preach that way, or not to use that because the Holy Quran doesn't speak of it, well, in what way should we use that for our own?
You see, this question of Jonah is still a question of debatable identity. Even from the study of Bible, the scholars have not yet been satisfied as to who Jonah was and where he was born and where was Nineveh. It is the same Nineveh as we know now, or it was a different place. So a lot of debate is going on regarding the identity of Jonah, his place of origin, and where this prophecy came to be fulfilled. According to the biblical statements, as understood today by the biblical scholars, he was not born in that part where we understand him to have been born, where this event has to be taken place. But he was born on the western coast of Palestine somewhere. No, not born, but he took the ship, the famous boat, from the western port. I don't remember the name, but I mentioned it perhaps in my khutbah. And there he failed in his trust in God. And as such, God sent him back, punished him and sent him back, and all this story. Now, because of there being so much confusion and contradiction in the biblical account, what I did was, I said, let us take the whole episode from the ordinary, point of view of common sense and logic. Let's consider the two statements and compare them from the logical point of view. Which story holds water, which does not. So as such, I debunked the story of Jonah as generally reported from the biblical sources and understood by the biblical scholars, and spoke on the subject of the Quranic treatment of the same, and said this is not only logical, this is exactly how it did happen, because the events are well connected in a chain of events and everything is understandable, logical and natural. So that was the general import of the khutbah or sermon which you are referring to. Now, in the light of this explanation, I would like you to reframe your question and let me know exactly what you want to know from me about this.
Just that, how should elderly people now, when they used to use that as a way of preaching, What way should we use it, or should we use it at all?
By way of preaching, I can't. This is why I said so many things, because I thought either you were not clear of what I had said, or I failed to understand your question, and that position still remains the same.
Okay. On my behalf, I understood the answer, and like
Yes.
I know exactly what I will do for the future.
Correct.
But I was thinking, whereas there is some books where they stress the 3 days and 3 nights, whereas a lot of maybe Ahmadis who haven't heard your tape.
Yes, I understand now. Yes, I know the difficulty. What I meant now, that is another area completely which I didn't touch upon now. Another very important point which I raised was that it is commonly understood that Jonah remained in the belly of fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And Ahmadis also have been using this argument in favor of Jesus' delivery from cross. They say that as Jonah remained for 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of fish, so also Jesus was to be in the belly of earth, as Jonah remained alive despite the fact that normally a person should have died much earlier than 3 days in the belly of fish. So also it was a prophecy applicable to Jesus Christ, that he would remain within the belly of earth and still come out whole. Now, I pointed out that Jonah did not remain in the belly of fish for 3 days and 3 nights, nor did Jesus Christ for that matter. So, accepting one myth, you lead yourself into another difficulty. While if a Christian turns back to you and say, actually, Jesus did not remain in the belly of earth for that period, then you will start counting the period of the time when he was crucified initially, and then he was taken down and also kept for a while, and then remained injured or under the wouldn't remain in the state of let's say while he was wounded, that injury continued seriously, let's say, for a while. So counting all this period where the injury could result into serious consequences, we say it is 3 days and 3 nights. So why to enter that involved argument at all? If there was a truth in this, the Holy Quran must have mentioned it. The Holy Quran, the style of the Holy Quran, as I have understood it in comparison to the biblical stories, is that when it broaches upon the same subject as Old or New Testament have already discussed, then it is always it always adopts a certain attitude very clearly, and without fail it is always the same attitude. It takes that part of the statement which is correct. It rejects all those parts which are incorrect or unnatural, and it improves upon certain parts of the statement and then makes them more logical, more understandable, so that we know that it is this which God must have said before, which was distorted and misreported later on. Now this is the Quranic style applicable to all such cases where a biblical statement has been incorporated in the Holy Quran, partly or fully, always with these, let's say, corrective measures. In this case, Jonah is supposed to have remained in the belly of fish for 3 days and 3 nights, according to the biblical report. Now, this claim of the Bible is completely ignored by the Quran. It is not even rectified. You see? So, this falls into the category of those statements which are totally rejected. So a statement rejected by the Holy Quran must have been rejected with some purpose. Why should we adopt it? Now, I know for the sake of argument, sometimes during a debate, one takes up such arguments as well which are binding on your opponent, with which you may not agree yourself. But because they are binding on your opponent, so in logic this is acceptable. That quote to your opponent his own belief and then corner him. Hazrat Masih Maud ﷺ has also adopted this policy. The Holy Quran also has adopted this policy. Not the Quran, but the Quran has reported this policy to have been adopted by earlier prophets, like Hazrat Abraham. When he debated the issue of who destroyed and demolished the idols, he put himself into their position and asked, you know they are gods, they should know. So ask this eldest and the biggest of the idols. He must have broken. He must have destroyed the others. Now this was a logical attitude. It was not an attitude which depicted Abraham's own beliefs at all. He did not believe in idols, that is why he broke them. So that is what I mean. Hazrat Masih Maud ﷺ has also, like Hazrat Abraham and some other prophets, adopted the same strategy during his debates with his opponents. I have noticed it many times in the study of those debates. But those Ahmadis who do not understand these things, and sometimes the opponents who do not understand these things, they say, look here, Muslim said this, so that must have been his belief. It is not true. Even the Holy Quran has used these tactics against the belief of Christians that Jesus Christ must have been literal Son of God because he had no father. The same Christians believe that Adam was without father and mother. So when the Holy Quran used this argument against them, it did not mean at all that God is declaring that Adam was born out of nothing, without a father or without a mother. So some Muslim scholars who have misunderstood it find themselves in great difficulty. And earlier they used to actually believe that Adam had no father and no mother. But nowadays, when in the period of scientific light, they can't accept this view and they find themselves in great difficulty. What they fail to understand is this is an instrument of logic used against your opponent, and the principle is that if he believes, your opponent believes in something which is false, you can use that belief against him as if it were correct and prove the stupidity of that situation. So that is how some Ahmadis have also been using this argument, and I told them that now you should better use some more caution, because if Christians begin to rebut you by declaring that according to the Bible he did not remain for 3 days and nights in the valley, what would your answer be? You understand the whole point now? Thank you.
Thank you. Clear.
Any other question, please? Yes, there's one other. Yes, Taha Qazak Sahib.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
There is in نظام الاقتصاد في الإسلام for Al-Muslih Maw'ud, rahimahullah. He says in page 115, I read in Arabic, then I say in English. إلى متى يمكن إبقاء الروس في المخازن المثلجة وسينقض هذا الجدار في يوم من الأيام وسترى الدنيا يومئذ تطورا عظيما. He said that a wall will fall down. Till what time the Russia put the people in a stores frigidaire?
Pardon?
In a stores frigidaire stores.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
when the wall come down, many things will happen in the world, big things. And we saw, everyone knows about the wall of Berlin when fell down. This is a wall of Madda.
Right.
But there is another wall in Quran Kareem. حتى إذا أتيا أهل قرية استطعم أهلها فأبوا أن يضيفوهما فوجدا فيها جدارا يريد أن ينقض فأقامه قال لو شئت لاتخذت عليه أجرا. This wall is religion wall that by Al-Masih Wasalam Dhul Qarnayn, he will build it again. That wall fell down and this wall will he build it again. And he say, when he translate to Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, he says this al-jdaru, there is a kanz tahtahu, like a kanz mal under this jidar, and there is ghulamaini yatimaini, two child is yatim, and we want when she become big, and we give him this kanz. I feel that this yatimaini is Shia and Sunnah in Russia, because now they are yatim. They don't know how to use wudu. They don't know how to pray. Because long time, 70 years, no read Quran Kareem and no teach anything. And outside Russia, Sunnah and Shia, impossible to become friendly after Iraq war and Iran and the Gulf war. But they are yatim. We know the yatim become friendly quickly. The Shia and Sunnah in Russia. And this will build, inshallah, by
Yes, I understand your point of view.
This I feel.
But please tell me, those Shias and Sunnis who are outside Russia, are they not orphans?
Because there is many differences.
Who is an orphan? Spiritually and metaphorically speaking, an orphan is the one who has lost his parents, who loses direction, who loses guidance. There is nobody to look after him and guide him at the time of need, at the time of confusion. Nobody tells him which is the right path. So those who reject the guided one from Allah, they always become orphans.
Yes, they will become friendly.
All those Muslims and others who have rejected the guided person from Allah, the Mahdi, must be understood as orphans. This happens every time God sends some reformer. That means he takes the leadership and abuwat in his own hand. And when God creates a father figure for the unguided people, then those who do not accept that father figure are orphans. So I don't see Sunnis and Shias living in Russia as greater orphans than the ones living outside Russia. They are in fact holding a more advantageous position than the people outside. The people outside have rejected, knowing full well that the truth is not with them. They are misguided, they are disunited, there is no sign of the true ummah of Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam among them. Al-mu'minuna ikhwa, and they are not ikhwa. Tarahum, I'll tell you, Tasubuhum jamiyum wa qulubuhum shatta is applicable to them as well, which is a verse which was applicable to the non-believers. Is that not correct? When you begin to say Shia Sunni are divided, then qulubuhum shatta immediately applies on both Shias and Sunnis. And when you further go into the minor deviance within Shias and within Sunnis, major deviance but comparatively minor, I mean, then you again begin to see that they are further divided. Then when you consider what is happening within Wahhabism and within Brahmanism and this and that, all ulama belonging to the same sect are also divided. You know, they build their own, as we say in Urdu, 1.5 brick mosque. Each mullah of a mosque is also divided from the other mullah of the mosque belonging to the same sect. Because unity can only be rehabilitated in religion when God sends a reformer and all get united around him and accept his word to be the right word. Then through Khilafat this unity is continued. So this is exactly true. There is no exaggeration that the world of Islam, which is outside the blessing of Khilafat, is like Yatama. That means we should take more pity on them. We should take greater care for them, because this is what the Holy Quran teaches us and repeatedly tells us that be careful, be mindful of your Yatama. Don't leave them alone, because they have unfortunately accepted this state of being orphans for themselves, of course, but still you must always be mindful of them. You should pity them, you should take all measures possible to improve their lot and should not leave them as abandoned. So that is why, despite what I say, I have a deep feeling for all the Muslims who have rejected Hazrat Masih Maud and I pity them in the same spirit as Hazrat Masih Maud himself did. And there the tafsir or the explanation of Yatama has been made at its highest. He says, "Ay dil to neez khatare ina nigahdar, kakhar kunand, dawa hubbe poyambaram." O my heart, please have regard for this fact as well. Do have regard for this, that they claim to love the same Holy Prophet whom I love so much. Claim to love is the dividing line. So they used to belong to the same father, spiritual father, to whom I belong now. But unfortunately they have lost. So for that they deserve greater pity from me rather than hatred or remoteness from them. So all are Yatama. I don't see any difference.
But especially in Russia, because I feel one man came here.
I think they are less Yatama than more.
Yeah.
Because they are in a better frame of mind to accept Ahmadiyyat. They are not crooked. They don't, become mulish in their attitude to Mr. Sallallahu claims. They are not adamant on their follies. Whenever I discuss things with them, whoever has so far come to me, without fail I have always found the response to be logical, sensible, understandable. I tell them, this is their view, this is our view, what do you think? So obviously this is the view, this is the right view. There can't be any other view, that sort of thing. So you may continue to believe them to be more Yatama, I believe them to be less Yatama.
Yeah, and one time I was in Bulgaria, passed in my car. One worker, many Turkish there, Muslims, yes, and they work in the streets. One man came to me when I parked. He asked me about Quran Kareem. You have Quran Kareem?
Yes.
I said, I have small one, I give it to him. All the workers, about 20, 50, leave job and they came to see Quran Kareem. And I afraid from police, I ran away. They want to give me money. I said, no, this is for you, Hadiyah.
But now we are doing it openly there in Bulgaria.
This yatim, we have Quran Kareem.
What I'm telling you is, now those Yatama have now turned into something completely different.
Yeah.
nowadays our delegation is in Bulgaria, taking part in an exhibition of Ahmadiyya literature, translation of the Quran, etc. And the first reports which I have received are more encouraging than I could ever expect. The entire attention of the intelligentsia is now focused on this exhibition. The librarian who is in charge of the exhibition first had fixed the period to be just 1 week. Now, after seeing it, the very first day himself, he was so impressed that he said, this must continue for at least 2 weeks. And the Muslim leader, Ridwan, who is the member of parliament and leader of a party, he expressed his view, or another professor, I don't know which, but one of the two very important people, that you don't know, it is a very great thing for him to have done. Because all the days of the years are previously booked. So he must have scratched some other programs and gone through a lot of trouble in extending the period from 1 week to 2 weeks. Then he said that all members of parliaments must be invited to this exhibition. Then he said all intelligentsia must be invited. So he published an open invitation and distributed it far and wide for the people to come and benefit from this. And the interest created among the people who come and visit this is immense. They are already booking orders for books and this and that. So this is why I said, apparently there are more yatama, but potentially there are much less yatama. They are looking for a father and they are ready to accept it. Others think they don't need anything. They don't need any guidance. But this father figure question also may be misleading. Actually, Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam has been described in the Holy Quran not as a father but as more than a father. This I must explain to you now, because Khatam al-Nabiyyin is a term which is not expressive of his being a father. Prophets are father, and he is the father of all prophets. So his relationship to all the ummas is more than that of a father. He is father to all prophets. You understand this point? So being Khatam, people having left his spiritual son, is truly the state of being orphan. Hazrat Masih Maud should be taken to be understood as the spiritual son of the father of all prophets. And those who reject him, they impose on themselves a state of orphanage from which unfortunately they can't be led out because of their obstinacy. Right? Still you can have the right to understand them to be greater orphans. I don't have any objection against that, as far as you believe that. Yes, please. Assalamu alaikum.
Two of our sisters would like to ask questions.
Yes, please.
The first is Sister Nashwa, and she has written her question in Arabic, and Sister Maha has translated it into English.
Right. Will Maha read it or will you read it?
Maha will read it.
Please.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
The question of Sister Nashwa is regarding the miracles of the prophets. She says that we know that God is able to do anything, but He does everything according to the laws of nature. But what she wants to understand is how was Hazrat Jesus ﷺ born without a father, and if this is a supernatural miracle from God. And the second part of her question is she wants to understand the wisdom. Why does God make the miracles of the prophets in the Holy Quran seems like supernatural miracles? And what is the wisdom behind this?
Supernatural miracles?
It seems as if it's when we read the Holy Quran, it seems seems as if it's supernatural, like the rod of Hazrat Musa.
Yes, I understand now the point. You see, first of all, the understanding of miracle has to be corrected. The word, I have spoken on this subject at length and in depth repeatedly so many times now that I can't repeat all that I have already said in this short session. First of all, I advise you to get those cassettes which are available here and pass them on to the lady who has asked this question. She can listen to them, and inshallah all the aspects of the question which are bothering her will be resolved. But because she is here and she has asked a question, briefly I'll answer this. Miracle does not mean that God makes a law and breaks it. That is a reflection upon God. It is not an attribute to God. Any sane person who makes laws and knows at times he will have to deviate from those laws always leaves exceptions. And they are incorporated in the legal code so that without breaking the law, he meets the extraordinary situations and resolves them satisfactorily. How could one expect of God to have created law of nature himself, yet having left no cushioning, no alternative possibilities, so that when some crisis arrives which cannot be resolved by the ordinary law, God has to break his own law himself? That is a situation totally inconceivable from our point of view. As we understand the logic of the Quran and the logic of God's personality, we totally reject this concept. Hazrat Masih Maud, speaking on the same subject, has mentioned that laws have many tiers. Some laws are known to man. Some overriding laws are still there but unknown to man. So a miracle appears to be a miracle to an ordinary person when he knows only the superficial laws which are known to man of that period and does not know the other set of laws which are also laws, which don't break these laws but are overriding. The example which Hazrat Masih Maud has not given but I have been giving, I can give here once again. The law of magnetism. The law of magnetism was unknown to the people of some thousand years ago, and even people of a few hundred years ago in some parts of the world. They know only the law of gravity, that the earth must pull everything down to itself. This is how they understand the law of gravity. Now, if a magnetic field was created above a person and who was wearing also a metal which responded to that magnetic field, and he was lifted, the people who did not understand the phenomenon of magnetism would consider it a miracle in the sense that the law is broken, while no law is broken. Gravity is also a law of nature and magnetism is also a law of nature, and one law put against the other follows the overriding principle that whichever acts more strongly would win. But the laws will not be broken. Similarly, in earlier times, many things about the chemistry and physics were unknown, and people who knew those things in advance of the age would be able to bring about certain tricks through their knowledge. And people would understand that he is master of the law, he breaks laws, while the fact would be that he is not breaking any laws. So God so ordains that those laws of nature are brought to operation. which normally are not active. And under the influence of those superior and more powerful laws, the weaker laws submit. And this is a law in itself. In the struggle between matter and life, the unbreakable, overwhelming, overriding law is this, that whichever law operates more strongly will subdue the law which operates less strongly. So in this way, miracles appear to be a breach of nature, while they are not a breach of nature. You know, in the history of Morocco, there is one recorded fact that once some magician, so-called magician in Morocco, started showing some very interesting tricks which he presented in a way that he was a holy man, and because of his holiness he could conquer nature and show this freak phenomenon. Now he used these tricks politically and started declaring to the Moroccans that the French rule is against the will of God and it is the rule of devil, so you must rebel against it. When the French government was informed of this, the central French government, this is happening and it's creating great problems. Actually, people begin to believe in that man as a holy person while he is just conjuring up tricks. And because of the influence on the people of these tricks, they are now becoming openly rebellious. So the French government did a very wise thing. They asked for some better and more knowledgeable and more competent magician, French magician, to report to the government, and out of some, one was chosen. And he was dispatched post haste to Morocco. Wherever this holy man started showing his tricks, he countered him by superior tricks and said, "You are less holy than I am. I can counter some of your tricks and show you some tricks which you can't repeat." So, because of this counter false holiness, the ultimate problem was ultimately resolved. Now, what was the impression of the people who were looking at these things from their lower vantage point? They looked up to this phenomena as supernatural in both cases. But neither was supernatural. So we reject the concept of supernaturalism in the world of God. God is all powerful. He is all knowledgeable. The real miracle is that when some people are weak, and if you feed some facts into the computer regarding their confrontation, the weak people of God, their confrontation with those who are all powerful against them, the normal result that the computer should show would be that the weaker will be obliterated and the powerful will win. The miracle is that there is unseen hand of power, unseen by the people, which is on the side of the weak. And because that hidden hand of power is the strongest, so despite the fact that the law is not broken, yet the weak appear to win. This always happens without fail. In every time when a prophet of God is sent. So the miracle, the true miracle is the victory of the weak over the powerful. The supreme law that the powerful will always win and the weak will always be obliterated seems to be reversed in this case. But here again I remind you that this law is not broken. The fact is that the powerful hand of God remains unseen. But the weak win not because they are weak and still they win. They win because the hand of God is with them. This is the philosophy which has been explained by the Holy Quran itself. In that verse of the Holy Quran of Surah Al-Hajj, where the believers are permitted to defend themselves with sword against their oppressors. There, this phenomenon has been explained in so many words. أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتَلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى نَصْرِهِمْ لَقَدِيرٌ. They are weak, that is why they have been transgressed against. And they are permitted to fight, not to be destroyed. Because إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى نَصْرِهِمْ لَقَدِيرٌ. Because God is all powerful, and the all powerful God is on the side of the weaker. So this still remains a miracle to those who don't understand this phenomenon. I have read many, a Western scholar, express this with wonder, that everything said and done still is inexplicable. How the weak forces which were siding with Prophet Muhammad became so overwhelming and emerged victorious over much greater forces and powers within Arabia and outside Arabia. So with this, I hope you will understand that the miracle is not breaking of a law. The miracle is the operation of an unseen law by a people who know that this person whom they consider a liar has no power over this law and has no knowledge of any other law. As such, when he shows something which is ununderstandable by the ordinary people, then they consider it to be a miracle, a mu'jiza, or whatever you call it, an ayat, whatever you call it. So in case of Hazrat Musa and others, in case of the splitting of moon, there has to be a scientific explanation behind it. And that explanation is sometimes given in the Holy Quran. And sometimes it is not given, so people still don't understand. There are two, and now I'll turn to the miracle of Moses, two miracles of Moses. They are the shining of the hand as bright white, without defect, without blemish. Not like that of a leper, but that of a healthy man, a hand which shines with light. And the other is the destruction of the magic of his opponents, who threw their ropes and made them appear as snakes. Now, in the first case, God has not explained how it happened. In the case of the hand, which is put in the hands or under the armpit and then extended, and suddenly the people begin to see it as shining with a brilliant light. That has not been explained in the Quran. But the second mu'jiza has been explained. And that satisfies human intellect that what happened was not a break of law, but the operation of a law which was not understood by the people at that time. The Holy Quran says, number one, وَسَحَرُوا أَعْيُنَ النَّاسِ. Their magic was not applied to the ropes themselves. The ropes remained ropes. But the magic spell was cast on the eyes, on the sight. And in the second place, it says that they imagined, the people who were observing, the Holy Quran says, they imagined the ropes to be snakes. So that shows they were not turned into snakes. That means there is another law that human mind can work on other human minds through mesmerism, through hypnotism. And this has become a reality, a scientific reality now. At that time it was not understood. So relatively at that time, a thing which was a miracle, if repeated today, will not be a miracle anymore. So whether the miracles belong to Moses or anybody else, the fact remains that those miracles were beyond the power of the person who was showing them. That is how they led to God. On the one hand, now this should be understood very clearly, on the one hand were trained magicians, the very cream of the entire magician population of Egypt, who knew the art, who had learned the art from their childhood, and they had no equal in this realm of magic in the entire Egypt. And everybody knew, Pharaoh inclusive, that Moses had no knowledge of magic. So he was positively sure that if he has learned a small trick, he would be defeated by these great magicians. Now the magicians also knew full well that Moses had no knowledge of magic. So when they saw that Musa threw his staff and suddenly their magic spell was broken, then they understood that the power which is working is that of God, not that of Moses himself. So despite the fact that he also did not break a law of nature by throwing that staff, but suddenly the spell which was cast on the eyes got shattered. And that also happens, this is logical. A superior willpower breaks the inferior willpower. So it was the will of God, in fact, which broke that, and the staff must have worked as a sort of catalytic agent. No, the noise, the throwing of the staff, that must have created that noise which broke the spell under the will of God. So because this has been explained in the Holy Quran, we understand from this demonstration that other miracles are also explainable on the same principle. Some we know, some we don't know. For some we offer explanations, for some we cannot. But in principle we know that with the passage of time, with more knowledge gained, a time would come when all these miracles will be explained by greater knowledge of science. But still they will remain miracles. Because the person on whose hands these miracles appeared had no knowledge of that science which is known to us today or will be known tomorrow to man. And yet he was able to perform that. Now you understand, I hope you fully understand this answer, which I hope covers both the aspects of the question. Ms. Maha, I'm addressing you.
Yes, it's clear now. Somebody wants to ask another question.
Oh, yes, please, yes. But it is clear to you, perhaps even before you ask this question?
Yes.
I'm asking about your friend.
Yes, it's
She's satisfied?
Yes.
Alhamdulillah. Good. Now the second question, please, from the lady side.
It's not a second question, but I just want a clarification.
Yes.
You have just talked about the law of mesmerism, which worked from a human being to another human being. What about the incident when Hazrat Musa threw his asa on River Nile and water split? So in that miracle...
No, I don't say it was the noise alone, because then anybody could break that magic by creating a noise. What I said was, God must have employed that moment in a manner that the noise created by the throwing of staff, or the very act of throwing of the staff, created a counter impression and helped the spell to be broken. But all this was done under Allah's superior will. not the mere act of throwing of staff could achieve this. It got in alignment with the design of Allah. And many a time God uses His own creation to create some special effects. So I think otherwise one could have argued that why throwing of staff at all? Why not just Moses saying, break, O spell, and the spell would be broken, you know. So that is why I say God Himself uses His own nature to enhance certain effects. So this act of throwing of the staff enhanced that effect which God's will did create, and the very act of throwing of the staff was not sufficient to create that effect.
So do we say that that some miracles happen just because of God's will, and we don't understand the reason behind it?
Fine?
Do we just understand that some miracles therefore happen because of pure...
I say all miracles happen under this principle. Miracles and magic, these are the two things which apparently belong to the same category but do not belong to the same category, and they have to be defined before we finish discussion of this topic. Then I hope that if there is any confusion left in your mind, it will be also removed. It will also be removed, like the previous ones. The question is, miracle happens when a person has no knowledge himself of bringing about some tricks, and he has no knowledge of the future either. So the miracles do not belong only to the realm of magical performances. The miracles have a much wider realm. There are miracles of prophecies. There are miracles of the knowledge of the past, which is lost to the mankind, but which God reveals to His prophets, and their declaration of that lost knowledge is a proof that God must have told this person that. This is also a miracle. So miracles, number one, should be understood to be something of a much wider application and wider sphere than just the art of producing magic. Number two, when magic is used against the forces of God, against the representatives of God, then God counters that magic by a superior law which is not known either to the magicians themselves or to the person who is confronting those magicians. So that does not mean, therefore it appears that the miracle which occurs at the hands of a prophet of God, although it is explainable logically by the study or deeper study of law, yet it still remains miracle because it was beyond the power either of the opponents or of the person who showed that miracle in that time, during that time scale or that time setting. At that particular period in time, such things were impossible for man to produce. So even if man can produce them today, ordinarily, in everyday life, in relation to that time, those events would still remain to be miracles and signs of God's favor. Now, in the light of what I have said, if any remaining portion remains to be asked, please do not hesitate. So yes, please. Now I am turning to men. I am turning to Muzaffar. So if from ladies' side if there is any other question, you may please wait for a while.
Assalamu alaikum, Hazur.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
It's just to pick up on what one of the ladies said a minute ago,
Yes.
about the question of the staff. When Hazrat Musa alayhi salam and the Israelites were escaping from Pharaoh, the Quran and the Bible say that he struck the waters and the waters divided and allowed Hazrat Musa and his followers to escape, and then the waters closed over the pursuers. Do we count that as a miracle, or was this magic? I think this is what the lady was asking.
Yes. Was it? Was this the question?
She started to ask this.
Maybe.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I then interfered with the question before it was completed. If this is what she wanted to ask, I want to answer this question, of course not differently. It will be a projection of the same answer as I have already given. That staff of Moses became a symbol of power of God in the hands of Moses. So it was used not only for defeating the magicians of the court of Pharaoh, but also it was employed to create similar effects in other situations. For instance, it was the same staff which was used to find water when there was no water. And it was the same staff which was used to remove water when there was water. So these two miracles should be understood and studied in juxtaposition. When he was about to enter, now let me first remove another misunderstanding. It was not the Dead Sea, the Red Sea, which he crossed. There is a complete misunderstanding by the people on this question. It was the Sea of Reeds which was mentioned, and I have seen that area where reeds grow along Nile, and that is a boggy area where sometimes water increases in level. When the sea level rises, that sea of reed is covered. Because of the reeds, that portion is called Sea of Reeds. So what the Old Testament mentioned was not the Red Sea, but the Sea of Reeds. So that Sea of Reeds had this normal daily phenomenon that sometimes water rose in level and sometimes it receded along with the tide and ebb of the sea. So when Moses was about to enter, then it must have been covered by water at that time. God must have told him, this is my reconstruction from my own imagination what might have happened, must have told him, use the same staff. This staff is now being held in awe by the people. People who follow you, they do not fully believe in you, not all of them. So some more miracles are to be shown to them. So use the same staff, which must have been held in great awe by the ordinary simple people. This is the staff which has brought about this destruction of the magic. So strike the water with this. As he did, the natural phenomenon which was already in operation started to unfold itself more rapidly, and according to some explanations of that period, not by Muslims but Christian and Jewish scholars, strong winds were blowing which ultimately cleaved a passage from, in the heart of that reed of sea, that Sea of Reeds. And that was also the time for the water to recede normally. So that is why Bible describes it as a sort of ocean rent asunder, split into two parts. Now, winds were blowing very powerfully from one direction to the other at that period, and the sea gave way. And because if you know the reeds area, you would also know that the water level there although it covers some reeds, but is not very high. It may drown a person all right, but it is not very high. If it receives by a few feet, then it becomes possible. So something like that must have happened, and dry land appeared, which was also boggy, of course. So as Moses and his companions started going across that passageway which was created by either the forces of winds as have been suggested by some scholars, or some other phenomenon, we don't know very clearly. As they were about to reach the other end, from the first end, the armies of Pharaoh, along with all their cavalcades and things, appeared. And they saw the passage clear. They did not know what had happened. So in their haste, they started following Moses and his followers. And as they reached maybe 1/3 or half the width of the sea of reeds, the winds must have started, lulling and calming down. Or maybe sometimes it happens so quickly that one doesn't know. Sometimes they begin to blow in another different direction. So some law of nature which was operative at that time must have changed its direction. Yet it remained a law of nature. The result was that suddenly the water which was pushed apart under the great force of wind, when that force was no longer there, then it rushed back with a revengefulness. Suddenly it must have closed with such violence and vengeance that the water level there should have risen more than the ordinary level, because this is exactly what scientifically happens. Artificially create a rift within the water, remove the obstacles which hold the water apart, and then with the rush of the waves and the water, the level would rise even beyond. So I believe something like that must have happened. But if the question is regarding the staff, what role did it play? It played exactly the same role as it played earlier at the time of confrontation of Moses with the magicians. Not a direct role. Not that staff in itself had some power to bring about anything. It was only as a symbol used by God to give impression to the people around him, those who believed in him particularly, that this man had some special powers. Thank you. Yeah? Now, I should consider this question to be the last, because I have other engagements, and which should have started normally at 5:30. But I told them to push the engagements by 15 minutes or so. Already we have crossed that point as well. So I hope you will excuse me for stopping this very interesting question and answer session after this question. All right? This is one question or
yes,
so many?
Just one question.
Okay.
So
But you're holding quite a few sheets in your hand.
They are blank.
Huh?
They are blank. So this is a question from an English friend who is present in this meeting,
Right.
but he has asked me to put this question on his behalf.
Is he also present here now?
Yes, he is present.
Right, okay.
He has been learning about Islam for the last 2 years, and he has found quite a good few points in Islam. But as he comes from a Catholic background,
Right.
and he has seen harshness and cruelty in religion, he has developed deep feelings of fear about religion and religious people. He feels very bitter about religion. He says that he wants to join Islam, but he does not feel right and satisfied in his heart and in his mind. He does not want to join under false pretense of piety. He wants to know what should he do. He wants Huzur's guidance in this situation.
Wherever, in any religious denomination, an inquirer finds even a small element of falsehood, pretensions, display of things which they do not possess. He should keep away from such people and such faith. This is a simple advice. There can't be any other advice. But if his investigation reveals to him that in some sections of the same religion, people have different understanding of the same religion. People practice the same religion differently from others, and there is no objection whatsoever from human point of view on the beliefs they hold about that religion. And if they act also accordingly, and there is no hypocrisy in such people, then there is no reason for him to remain hesitant and reluctant about joining that religion at all. And I believe Ahmadiyyat is just a case in point. We also abhor murder in the name of God and persecution in the name of holy things. But we are on the receiving end. We are not on the delivering end. We reject it and we are punished for that rejection. So what would he do? What would he perhaps like himself to do? If he is afraid of persecution, as some of the sentences indicate, is afraid, then he should not join us. He would rather join the persecutors. Because in this world they have the upper hand and they have nothing to fear from us. But he is afraid of God. If he is afraid of cruelty itself, if he abhors cruelty, then we are the only answer. He should join us, and here he will find his conscience to be at complete rest with his understanding of how godly people should work. Right? So that is all. I have seen an old Iraqi brother of mine after a long time. Huh? Where have you been? Are you all right? Yeah, happy? Your wife has also come? No, she hasn't. Okay. Very pleased to meet you, or see you, from this distance at least. Assalamu alaikum.